There is a volcano in the southern Philippines that almost nobody outside the Bicol region has been following this week. That is about to change. The volcano is Bulusan. It sits in Sorsogon province, at the southeastern tip of Luzon, the largest island in the Philippine archipelago on the edge of the Bicol volcanic arc. It is 70 kilometers southeast of Mayon, the most famous volcano in the Philippines. It is 390 kilometers from Metro Manila. It sits within the crater of something much older and much larger, the erosion caldera, an 11-kilometer-wide depression left by a volcanic catastrophe that occurred approximately 36,000 years ago. Bulusan grew inside that ancient wound. The mountain that stands today is, in the most literal geological sense, a child of destruction. As of the PHIVOLCS advisory issued on May 20th, 2026, Bulusan has logged 442 volcano-tectonic earthquakes in 48 hours. That count covers the period from 1600 hours local time on May 18th through the morning of May 20th, 442 events in 2 days. Of those, 55 occurred at depths of less than 5 kilometers beneath the summit edifice, shallow fracturing, rock breaking close to the surface. And the GPS network has been showing inflation of the northern flank since June of 2025, nearly a year, and of the upper western flank since January of 2026. The Philippine Institute of Volcanology and Seismology is watching. Its advisory states explicitly that these parameters may indicate slow pressurization of the edifice, and that steam-driven or phreatic eruptions from any of the summit vents are possible. That is not routine language. That is a warning issued by the agency that monitors every active volcano in the Philippines and chooses its words carefully. We have been watching Bulusan for the past 72 hours. This report is the result. Tonight's report covers 3 layers. We want to lay them out precisely before we begin because the material is dense and the viewer who understands the shape of the report before it starts will follow its argument more clearly. The first layer is the current data. PHIVOLCS has issued its advisory. We will walk through every number in it, what 442 volcano-tectonic earthquakes means in concrete terms, what the distinction between shallow and deep seismicity tells us about what is happening beneath Bulusan's edifice right now, what the GPS inflation data means, what Bulusan's SO2 output is telling the monitoring network, what happened on May 17th, when a phreatic eruption lasted 3 minutes and threw a plume 300 meters into the air without any mainstream international coverage, and what the 4-kilometer permanent danger zone currently means for the communities in its shadow. We will explain the monitoring framework, PHIVOLCS operates, what instruments it deploys, how they work, and why the specific combination of readings currently coming from Bulusan's network is producing the language in that advisory. By the time we leave the data section, you will have a more complete picture of what PHIVOLCS is looking at tonight than any single news article about this event has provided. The second layer is the documented history of Bulusan's behavior. This is not a volcano that has been quiet and then suddenly surprised everyone. This is a volcano with a documented pattern of escalating seismic activity followed by phreatic eruptions, a pattern that has repeated consistently across the 20th and 21st centuries. We will examine the specific eruption events most relevant to tonight's reading. The June 2022 phreatic sequence, in the April 2025 eruption that sent ash 4.5 kilometers into the sky and lasted 24 minutes, and the deeper historical record that PHIVOLCS draws on when it issues its warnings. We will also examine the regional context, the broader Philippine volcanic arc, the 1991 Pinatubo eruption that remains the defining Philippine volcanic event of the modern era, and the relationship between Bulusan's current behavior and the documented behavior of other volcanoes on the same tectonic structure. The historical layer makes the current PHIVOLCS advisory legible in a way that the advisory alone cannot achieve. The third layer, and this is where tonight's report goes somewhere, no mainstream coverage of Bulusan's current activity will go, is the ancient record. The Bicol region of the Philippines has been inhabited for thousands of years. The people who lived in the shadow of Bulusan before any monitoring instrument existed, before PHIVOLCS, before seismometers, before GPS deformation networks, did not observe this volcano in ignorance. They observed it in a cosmological and spiritual framework that encoded what they understood about its behavior, its cycles, and its meaning. That framework is documented in the records left by Spanish missionaries who arrived in the Bicol region in the 16th century, by ethnographers who worked with the descendants of the pre-colonial Bicolano people in the 19th and 20th centuries, and in the broader Austronesian cosmological tradition that connects the Bicolano people to cultures across the Philippine archipelago and across the Pacific. Beyond the indigenous Philippine tradition, we will examine the Japanese Shinto record of volcanic fire encoded in the Kojiki, the oldest surviving written record in the Japanese language, compiled in 712 of the Common Era, and two further traditions that document the human understanding of volcanic behavior in ways that are specific enough to sit alongside tonight's PHIVOLCS numbers. We will get there. First, the science. Before we go further, if this kind of reporting is what you come here for, subscribe. We file every night. When PHIVOLCS issues its next Bulusan advisory, and based on the current trajectory, the interval between advisories is likely to narrow, we will file. When the seismicity at Bulusan changes in a way that moves the alert level, we will file. We watch the data that does not make the international news cycle. We report what we find. Depth is not optional here. It is the product. Subscribe and you will not miss what comes next. And tell us in the comments where you are watching from tonight. We see viewers from across the Philippines in every report that touches a domestic event. We see the Bicol region, we see Manila, we see the overseas Filipino diaspora watching from the United States, from the Middle East, from Europe, and we see the global audience watching because a volcano logging 442 earthquakes in 2 days deserves more coverage than it is currently receiving from the international press. Where you are watching from matters to us. Drop it below. The full record starts now. Bulusan is currently in a state of elevated seismic unrest. That classification, Alert Level 1, on PHIVOLCS's 5-level scale, does not mean the situation is minor. It means the volcano is exhibiting the specific pattern of parameters that precedes phreatic eruptions at this location. PHIVOLCS has documented that pattern repeatedly. It knows what it looks like, and what it looks like is what the instruments are showing right now. There is a number in the PHIVOLCS advisory that every mainstream report on Bulusan this week mentioned, and a different number that none of them did. The number every report mentioned is 442, the total count of volcano-tectonic earthquakes recorded since 1600 hours on May 18th. The number none of them mentioned is 55. That is the count of those 442 events that occurred at depths of less than 5 kilometers beneath Bulusan's summit edifice. The reason the distinction between those two numbers matters will be clear before this report closes. Volcano-tectonic earthquakes at a volcanic edifice are not the same as the tectonic earthquakes that occur along plate boundaries or fault lines. The distinction is important and worth spending time on. When rocks fracture under tectonic stress, the grinding and bending of crustal plates against each other, the resulting earthquake is classified as tectonic. When rocks fracture specifically because of the movement of magma or hydrothermal fluids within a volcanic system, because pressurized fluid is forcing its way through rock, cracking it as it moves, the resulting earthquake carries a specific seismic signature that volcanologists can identify and classify separately. These are the volcano-tectonic events. They tell the monitoring network something specific. There is fluid movement within the volcanic edifice. Something is moving through the rock. The 442 events logged at Bulusan since May 18th are all of this type. They are not background noise. They are signal. The 55 events at depths of less than 5 kilometers are the subset of that signal that is occurring closest to the surface. In the context of a volcano with an active hydrothermal system, which Bulusan undeniably is, as documented by its persistent summit fumaroles and the thermal springs on its flanks, shallow seismicity at depths of less than 5 kilometers indicates that the fracturing is happening in the zone immediately below the volcanic edifice. That is the zone through which hydrothermal fluids must travel to reach the surface vents. When fluid movement is generating earthquakes at that depth range, the possibility of a surface expression, a phreatic eruption, a steam-driven event is elevated in a meaningful way. PHIVOLCS' advisory explicitly states this. The parameters may indicate slow pressurization of the edifice due to shallow hydrothermal or tectonic processes that could lead to steam-driven or phreatic eruptions at any of the summit vents. That language is PHIVOLCS being direct about what it sees. The GPS ground deformation network provides the second major data stream that is informing tonight's monitoring picture. GPS deformation monitoring at Bulusan operates on the same fundamental principle as the GPS network at any volcano. By continuously tracking the precise position of benchmarks distributed across the volcanic edifice and flanks, the network can detect the very slight movements of the ground surface that indicate changes in the subsurface pressure system. Inflation, the outward movement of the ground surface, indicates that something is being added to the system below. Magma, fluid, gas, or some combination of these. What the GPS network at Bulusan is currently showing is inflation of the northern flank that has been underway since June of 2025, and inflation of the upper western flank that has been underway since January of 2026. These are not recent developments. The northern flank has been swelling for nearly a year. The western flank has been swelling for 4 months. The ground deformation data has been building a picture of a volcanic edifice under increasing internal pressure for the better part of the past 12 months. The 442 volcano-tectonic earthquakes logged in the past 48 hours are the most acute expression of a condition that the GPS network has been documenting at lower intensity for considerably longer. PHIVOLCS. The Philippine Institute of Volcanology and Seismology is the agency that bears primary responsibility for monitoring Bulusan and every other active volcano in the Philippine archipelago. It is a division of the Department of Science and Technology of the Republic of the Philippines, and it has been operating its National Volcano Monitoring Network since its establishment in 1984. The agency monitors 24 active volcanoes in the Philippines using a combination of seismic sensors, GPS deformation instruments, SO2 spectrometers, tilt sensors, and visual monitoring systems. Its Bulusan monitoring network includes the Bulusan Volcano Network seismometers, the GPS benchmarks we have discussed, and SO2 measurement instruments that are used to track sulfur dioxide emissions from the summit vents. The most recent SO2 measurement from Bulusan, taken on April 22nd, recorded an average emission rate of 121 tons per day. That is a low number, consistent with background degassing from the hydrothermal system rather than from direct magmatic outgassing. The relative quietness of the SO2 signal compared to the intensity of the seismic signal is one of the features of the current situation that PHIVOLCS is watching carefully. A vigorous seismic swarm with modest SO2 output is a specific pattern. It suggests that the rock fracturing is being driven by hydrothermal fluid pressurization, heated water, and steam pushing through the rock rather than by the direct ascent of fresh magma. Phreatic eruptions are the surface expression of this type of pressurization. They can occur with minimal advance warning. They can generate significant ash columns, ballistic projectiles, pyroclastic density currents, and lahars. And the history of Bulusan shows that this specific pattern, seismic swarm, GPS inflation, modest SO2, phreatic eruption has played out before, recently, more than once. On May 17th, 2026, 5 days ago, Bulusan had a phreatic eruption. It lasted 3 minutes. It generated a plume that rose 300 meters above the summit. It received no significant international coverage. It did not shift the PHIVOLCS alert level, which remained at 1, but it happened. A volcano with an 11-kilometer wide caldera, a vigorous hydrothermal system, 442 earthquakes in 48 hours, and a history of phreatic eruptions that includes events large enough to shut down provincial roads and cover communities with ash, had a steam-driven eruption 5 days before this report was filed. The eruption lasted 3 minutes. The mainstream international coverage of it lasted approximately 0 minutes. We note this and continue. The physical geography of Bulusan matters for understanding what a significant phreatic eruption at this location means for the surrounding communities. The volcano sits in Sorsogon province, the southernmost province of Luzon. The province has a population of approximately 1 million people, most of them in agricultural communities spread across the coastal plains and interior valleys that surround the Erosin caldera. The Erosin Valley, the broad agricultural basin that occupies the floor of the ancient caldera, is home to several municipalities whose land and communities are within or immediately adjacent to the 4-kilometer permanent danger zone that PHIVOLCS maintains around Bulusan's summit. The municipalities of Erosin, Juban, Casiguran, Bulusan, and Magallanes are all proximate to the volcano. In previous phreatic eruptions, most significantly, the events of June 2022 and April 2025 ashfall from Bulusan's eruption columns reached communities in Juban, Erosin, and Casiguran. Roads were temporarily closed. Residents in low-lying areas near river channels were placed on alert for lahars, volcanic mud flows that can travel rapidly downstream channels following an eruption that generates significant ash or during subsequent rainfall on fresh ash deposits. The communities in the Erosin Valley live with Bulusan as their constant geographic context. The 4-kilometer permanent danger zone that prohibits human entry around the summit is not a theoretical safety measure. It is the boundary of the zone that previous eruptions have demonstrated to be genuinely hazardous. The 4-kilometer permanent danger zone and the 2-kilometer extended danger zone on Bulusan's southeastern sector represent the minimum safety perimeters PHIVOLCS maintains, based on the documented hazard profile of the volcano's eruptions. The specific hazards that PHIVOLCS identifies: pyroclastic density currents, ballistic projectiles, rockfall, avalanches, and ashfall are all associated with phreatic eruption events of the type that the current seismic swarm is raising the probability of. A pyroclastic density current is a ground-hugging cloud of hot gas, ash, and volcanic fragments that travels at high speed down the flanks of a volcano. It is one of the most directly lethal volcanic hazards known. Bulusan's eruption history does not include major pyroclastic density current events in the recent documented record, but the potential for them is real enough that PHIVOLCS includes them in its hazard advisory language. The Erosin caldera itself is one of the structural features of this situation that deserves more attention than it typically receives in mainstream coverage of Bulusan activity. 11 kilometers wide, formed approximately 36,000 years ago, the Erosin caldera is the remnant of a volcanic system that was destroyed in an eruption of sufficient magnitude to evacuate the magma chamber and collapse the overlying structure. The caldera formation event 36,000 years ago was, by the geological evidence available, a cataclysmic eruption. Bulusan grew within the ruins of that event. It is, in the geological sense, a second generation, a volcano that was born from the destruction of its predecessor. The summit of Bulusan, at 1,555 meters above sea level, is substantially lower than the reconstructed pre-caldera peak would have been. The mountain standing today is built on the remains of a mountain that no longer exists. That geological context, the caldera, the ancient eruption that created it, the 36,000-year process by which Bulusan has grown within it, is the deep background against which PHIVOLCS is watching 442 earthquake events and issuing advisories about phreatic eruptions. The current activity is not anomalous in the context of Bulusan's eruptive history. It is consistent with it. That consistency is not reassuring, it is informative. We will return to the Erosin caldera's formation event when we reach the ancient record section of this report. The number 36,000 years matters in that context. Hold it. The data makes more sense when placed against what came before it. And what came before it at Bulusan, in the documented record of the past decade alone, is directly instructive for understanding what the current seismic swarm is telling the monitoring network. Bulusan's eruptive history in the modern documented record spans from the mid-19th century, when Spanish colonial administrators and missionaries began keeping systematic records of its activity, through the present monitoring era under PHIVOLCS. The volcano has produced many tens of eruption events in that period, the majority of them phreatic, steam-driven, involving the explosive interaction of hydrothermal water with the heat of the shallow volcanic system. This is the character of Bulusan's eruptions. It is not a lava-producing volcano in its recent behavior. It does not produce the sustained, effusive eruptions of a Kilauea or the lava dome-building activity of some other Philippine volcanoes. It produces steam, ash, gas, and sometimes pyroclastic material driven by the explosive release of pressure from the hydrothermal system that permeates its upper edifice. The frequency of these phreatic events and the pattern of seismic activity that precedes them is what gives the current PHIVOLCS advisory its specific weight. The June 2022 eruption sequence is the most instructive recent precedent. On June 5, 2022, Bulusan had a phreatic eruption. The eruption produced an ash column and generated ashfall in communities, including Juban and Erosin. PHIVOLCS raised the alert level to 1. Then, on June 12, 2022, Bulusan erupted again. This second eruption was more significant than the first. The plume reached 750 meters, more than twice the height of the May 17th event this year. Ashfall was reported in a wider area. So, two emissions spiked to 751 tons per day on June 23rd, a substantial increase from the background levels that preceded the eruptions. The pattern of the 2022 sequence is directly relevant to tonight's report. A smaller phreatic event, followed by a period of continued seismic unrest, followed by a second event of greater magnitude. The May 17th phreatic eruption at Bulusan 3 minutes, 300 meters may represent the first event in a similar sequence. Or it may be the entirety of the current cycle's surface expression. The data does not currently allow that distinction to be made with certainty. What it allows is the observation that the pattern seismic swarm, small phreatic event, continued inflation is structurally consistent with the pre-eruptive pattern documented in 2022. The April 2025 eruption is the larger recent reference point. On April 28, 2025, Bulusan produced a phreatic eruption that lasted 24 minutes and generated a plume that reached 4,500 meters, 4.5 kilometers above the summit. This was the most significant Bulusan eruption in the years immediately preceding the current seismic swarm. Ashfall affected the communities of Cogon and Bolos in Erosin, and Puting Sapa, Guruyan, Buraburan, and Tulatula Sur in Juban. PHIVOLCS raised the alert level from 0 to 1 following this event. In the period leading up to the April 2025 eruption, the monitoring network had recorded 53 volcanic earthquakes in the 24 hours immediately preceding the event, a smaller swarm than the 442 events currently logged, but structurally similar. Approximately 15 minutes before the eruption began, local government officials reported hearing rumbling sounds that were simultaneously detected by PHIVOLCS's infrasound sensors. The eruption that followed sent ash 4.5 kilometers into the sky and covered multiple communities. The current seismic count, 442 events in 48 hours, is significantly higher than the 53 events that preceded the April 2025 eruption. That comparison is worth sitting with. The regional context extends beyond Bulusan. The Bicol volcanic arc, of which Bulusan is the southernmost member, also includes Mayon volcano, the most active volcano in the Philippines, currently under a separate PHIVOLCS advisory for continued effusive activity, and Canlaon volcano on Negros Island. As of the most recent PHIVOLCS monitoring summary, Mayon remains at alert level 3, with continued lava effusion along multiple gullies and episodic minor strombolian activity. The simultaneous elevated activity at multiple volcanoes on the Philippine arc is not, in the formal scientific sense, necessarily connected. Each volcanic system has its own magma supply and its own pressurization cycle. But the monitoring network is tracking all of them simultaneously, and the current period represents one of the more active stretches of volcanic unrest across the Philippine arc in recent years. That pattern was recorded before our instruments existed to confirm it, and that older record begins now. The tradition most directly connected to Bulusan's current activity geographically, culturally, and in terms of the depth and specificity of its observational record is the pre-colonial Bicolano tradition of the Bicol Peninsula of Luzon. To approach this tradition with the seriousness it deserves, we need to understand the people who developed it and the landscape they developed it in. The Bicolano people are the indigenous Austronesian inhabitants of the Bicol region, the elongated southeastern peninsula of Luzon Island that includes the provinces of Camarines Norte, Camarines Sur, Albay, Sorsogon, Catanduanes, and Masbate. They are, by linguistic and genetic evidence, descended from the Austronesian-speaking populations that arrived in the Philippine archipelago approximately 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, part of the same broad expansion of seafaring peoples that eventually populated the Pacific and reached as far as Madagascar in the west and Hawaii in the east. The Bicolano language belongs to the central Philippine branch of the Austronesian language family and has been spoken in the Bicol Peninsula for at least 3 millennia. The people who speak it have been living in the shadow of active volcanoes Mayon, Bulusan, and the others on the Bicol arc for the entirety of that time. 3,000 years of living alongside active volcanoes produces a certain kind of knowledge. It is not the knowledge of seismometers and GPS deformation networks. It is the knowledge of community memory, transmitted across generations through oral tradition, ceremony, narrative, and ritual practice encoding. In the frameworks available to a pre-literate culture, the observed behavior of the natural world that determines survival. The Bicolano cosmological tradition that Spanish missionaries began documenting in the 16th and 17th centuries was not a young tradition. It was the product of 3,000 years of observation, encoded in the only recording medium available, human culture. The most important primary source for the pre-colonial Bicolano cosmological tradition in the Western scholarly record is the documentation produced by the Franciscan missionaries who arrived in the Bicol region in the late 16th century. Fray Francisco Collins' Liber Evangelica, published in Manila in 1663, is one foundational source. The Vocabulario de la Lengua Bicol, compiled by the Franciscan Marcos de Lisboa in 1654, is another a linguistic dictionary that, in its documentary effort to translate Bicolano into Spanish for missionary purposes, preserves a rich record of Bicolano cultural concepts, including those related to the natural world, the divine, and the relationship between them. Francisco Collins' documentation explicitly addresses the Bicolano understanding of natural phenomena as expressions of spiritual entities, the Diwata tradition that we introduced in the briefing section of this report deserves fuller treatment. The concept of Diwata in the pre-colonial Philippine cosmological tradition is not equivalent to the Western concept of deity in the Judeo-Christian sense. A Diwata is not omnipotent, not omniscient, and not the creator of the universe. A Diwata is a specific class of divine being, a spirit of significant power that inhabits or governs a specific domain of the natural world. Mountains have their Diwata. Rivers have their Diwata. The sea has its Diwata. Particular trees, particularly old and large ones, may have their Diwata. The Diwata of a volcanic mountain is understood as a being of considerable power, capable of producing the phenomena that the mountain exhibits, the eruptions, the tremors, the steam and gas emissions, the lava flows. These phenomena are not random geological events in the pre-colonial Bicolano framework. They are expressions of the Diwata's will, mood, or state. A volcanic eruption is the Diwata making itself known. Ground tremors are the Diwata moving within the mountain. The increase in fumarolic emissions, the stronger smell of sulfur, the denser steam rising from the summit vents is the Diwata breathing harder, gathering energy, preparing for a more significant expression. What makes this tradition analytically relevant to tonight's PHIVOLCS advisory is the specific language it uses for the precursory phase, the period before an eruption when the mountain is building toward a surface event. The Bicolano oral tradition, as documented in the missionary records and in the later ethnographic work of scholars including F. Landa Jocano and Zeus Salazar, describes this precursory phase with observable precision. The mountain shakes more than usual. The springs on the flanks become warmer. The fumaroles emit more vigorously. The smell of sulfur becomes detectable in communities that do not normally detect it. These are the signs that the Diwata is disturbed. Each of these signs corresponds to a specific parameter in the modern monitoring network: the seismic swarm, the thermal anomaly in monitored springs, the increase in SO2 emissions, the enhanced fumarolic activity. The pre-colonial Bicolano observer cataloged the same data that the PHIVOLCS monitoring station catalogs. The observer used a different recording system. The catalog is structurally consistent. The behavioral response to these signs in the pre-colonial Bicolano tradition is also documented. When the mountain showed the signs of the Diwata's agitation, the community's babaylan, the ritual specialist, the individual within the community who maintained the relationship between the human community and the spiritual entities of the natural world, was called upon to make offerings and to conduct the ceremonies appropriate to addressing a disturbed Diwata. Communities proximate to the mountain were warned. The 4-kilometer permanent danger zone that PHIVOLCS maintains around Bulusan's summit represents the modern institutional version of the boundary that the pre-colonial Bicolano tradition maintained informally but effectively. Do not approach the mountain when the signs of the Diwata's agitation are present. The babaylan tradition, documented by the Spanish missionaries with considerable alarm, since it represented an organized religious practice that competed with Christian missionary activity, was not merely ceremonial in the service of abstract spiritual concerns. It was, in its functional effects, a system of environmental monitoring, community communication, and hazard response. The babaylan watched the mountain. The babaylan interpreted the signs. The babaylan communicated the interpretation to the community and prescribed the appropriate response. This is what PHIVOLCS does, in different language and with different instruments. The 3,000-year tradition of the Bicolano babaylan, watching Bulusan and its companion volcanoes, reading their behavior, and advising their communities, is the intellectual ancestor of the monitoring tradition that PHIVOLCS represents today. We say this not to romanticize the pre-colonial tradition, but to recognize what it actually was: a sustained, culturally embedded, community-integrated system of volcanic hazard monitoring that functioned across 3 millennia without instruments, and that encoded, in the framework available to it, the same relationship between observable precursory signs and surface volcanic events that the PHIVOLCS seismic network is documenting in real time. The anthropologist F. Landa Jocano, whose scholarship on pre-colonial Philippine culture and mythology spans several decades and multiple published volumes, documented the Bicolano spiritual tradition in sufficient detail to make the connection between the Diwata concept and the observable behavior of volcanic mountains explicit. Jocano's work, which draws on field work conducted across the Philippine archipelago and on the extensive archival record left by Spanish missionaries, establishes the functional relationship between the behavior of volcanic and geothermal features and the religious and social practices that the communities living alongside them developed. His documentation confirms what the missionary records suggest. The pre-colonial Bicolano understanding of volcanic mountains was not superstition. It was empirically grounded, multi-generationally tested, and functionally effective. The communities that followed the babaylan's guidance when the mountain showed signs of agitation survived the eruptions that followed. That observational record, 3,000 years of community-level volcanic hazard monitoring in the Bicol region, is the oldest continuous record of Bulusan's behavior in any form. It predates the PHIVOLCS monitoring network by 3,000 years and the Smithsonian Global Volcanism Program's systematic record by more than that. When PHIVOLCS issues an advisory warning of possible phreatic eruptions at Bulusan based on 442 volcano-tectonic earthquakes and months of GPS inflation, it is issuing a modern version of the same warning that the pre-colonial Bicolano Babaylan would have issued when the mountain was shaking and the springs were warming. The language is different. The instrument precision is different. The underlying observation is the same observation. That is what belongs on the table alongside tonight/data. The second tradition we examine is the Japanese Shinto record of volcanic fire, and it deserves the full depth of treatment that the Bicolano tradition received, because it is among the most extensively documented ancient accounts of volcanic behavior in existence, and because the tectonic and geographic connection between the Japanese volcanic arc and the Philippine volcanic arc makes the parallel more than merely thematic. Japan is, like the Philippines, an archipelago formed by the subduction of oceanic crust beneath a continental margin. The specific plate tectonic configuration differs in its details. Japan's volcanoes are produced by the subduction of the Pacific plate and the Philippine sea plate beneath the Andexan, Eurasian plate, and the Okhotsk plate along multiple trench systems, but the fundamental geological mechanism is the same as the one producing Bulusan's activity. Subducted oceanic crust carries water into the mantle, lowers the melting temperature of the mantle rock, generates magma that rises through the overlying crust, and produces volcanoes at the surface. Japan has 111 active volcanoes. The Philippines has 24 monitored active volcanoes. Both archipelagos have been shaped by the same class of geological process for the same reason. They sit above subduction zones on the Pacific Ring of Fire. The people who developed Japan's cosmological tradition regarding volcanic fire, and the people who developed the Philippines' cosmological tradition regarding volcanic fire were observing the same geological phenomenon from different positions on the same ring. The Kojiki, compiled in 712 of the Common Era by the court scholar Ono Yasumaro, is the oldest extant chronicle in the Japanese language. It was compiled at the command of the Empress Genmei from oral traditions that the court recognized as being in danger of distortion and loss, and it was intended to preserve an authoritative version of the cosmological and historical narratives that formed the foundation of Japanese imperial legitimacy and Shinto religious identity. The Kojiki is therefore explicitly a preservation effort, the first great act of cultural documentation in Japanese history, and the traditions it preserves were already ancient at the time of its compilation. Scholars of Japanese religion and literature generally date the oral antecedents of the Kojiki's narratives to at least several centuries before the 7th century of the Common Era, making the traditions it records potentially as old as the first millennium before Common Era. The Kagutsuchi narrative within the Kojiki is one of the central creation myths of the Japanese tradition, and its relationship to volcanic fire is not incidental or metaphorical. Japan's volcanic landscape was the direct sensory context within which this narrative developed. The people who told the story of Kagutsuchi's destructive birth and death lived alongside volcanoes. They watched fire come from the earth. They experienced the seismic tremors that preceded eruptions. They saw the ash that darkened the sky. The narrative that emerged from that multi-generational observation encodes a specific set of understandings about volcanic fire that are worth examining carefully. The first understanding is that volcanic fire is inherently destructive in its genesis. Kagutsuchi's birth kills his mother. The fire is not a gift. It is a consequence of a process that cannot be controlled. The creation of fire produces death, not incidentally, not avoidably, but as a necessary feature of what fire is. This encoding reflects a specific observational truth about volcanic eruptions. They create new land while destroying what preceded them. The phreatic explosion that releases energy from Bulusan's hydrothermal system is simultaneously destructive to the immediate surface environment and part of the pressure release cycle that prevents a larger and more destructive event. Volcanic fire creates and destroys simultaneously. The Kagutsuchi narrative encodes this duality with a specific precision of a culture that has watched it happen across many generations. The second understanding is that the destruction wrought by volcanic fire produces new forms of fire. Kagutsuchi's dismemberment by the grief-stricken Izanagi gives rise to 8 new volcanic deities. The fire does not end with one event, it transforms. Each expression of volcanic fire produces the conditions for the next expression. This encoding reflects the observed cyclical behavior of volcanic systems. One eruption deposits material that contributes to future eruptions. One pressurization cycle releases energy that enables the reloading of the next cycle. The 442 volcano-tectonic earthquakes at Bulusan are the seismic expression of a pressurization cycle. When that cycle produces a surface event, a phreatic eruption, the pressure will be partially released. Then the hydrothermal system will reload. Then the seismicity will begin again. The cycle does not end. It regenerates. Izanagi killed Kagutsuchi, and 8 new fire deities were born from his body. The Kojiki encoded this 2,000 years before PHIVOLCS installed its first seismometer on Bulusan's flanks. The Nihon Shoki, compiled 8 years after the Kojiki, in 720 of the Common Era, provides a complementary account that adds specific detail to the Kagutsuchi narrative, absent from the Kojiki's version. The Nihon Shoki's account names the 8 volcanic deities born from Kagutsuchi's body with more specificity and associates each with a particular type of geological or volcanic feature. One is associated with rocky crags, another with the fire of the deep earth, another with the heat of volcanic springs. This specificity reflects a tradition that had developed over centuries of observation, a taxonomy of volcanic and geothermal phenomena, a classification of the different ways in which Earth's fire expresses itself at the surface. The fumaroles, the hot springs, the phreatic eruptions, each was understood as a distinct expression of the same underlying fire principle, each with its own divine representative in the cosmological framework. PHIVOLCS makes the same classification distinctions in its monitoring reports. Phreatic eruptions, magmatic eruptions, so too emissions. Ground deformation, different expressions of the same underlying volcanic system, each tracked with its own instruments. We will return to the significance of this parallel when we reach the 4th tradition. Hold the comparison. The 3rd tradition belongs to a cultural and intellectual lineage that reaches the Philippines through the long arc of Hindu-Buddhist cultural influence that shaped pre-Islamic kingdoms of maritime Southeast Asia. The Majapahit Empire, centered on East Java in what is now Indonesia, was at its height in the 14th century, the most powerful state in Southeast Asia, and its cultural influence extended through the Indonesian archipelago, across the Malay Peninsula, and into the Philippine Islands. Pre-colonial Philippine culture, including the culture of the Bicol region, shows significant traces of this Hindu-influenced cultural layer, documented in the use of Sanskrit-derived vocabulary in indigenous Philippine languages, in the cosmological frameworks recorded by early Spanish missionaries, and in the material culture of the pre-colonial Philippines. The Filipino scholar William Henry Scott, in his foundational work Pre-Hispanic Source Materials for the Study of Philippine History, documented the traces of this Indic cultural influence in pre-colonial Philippine culture. The pre-colonial Philippines was not untouched by this Vedic-influenced cultural current. The Bicolano tradition that the Spanish missionaries documented in the 16th century bore traces of it. Within this Vedic-influenced cultural framework, fire was not merely a physical phenomenon. It was Agni, one of the most ancient and most extensively documented divine principles in the Vedic tradition, present in the oldest hymns of the Rig Veda, which date in their written form to approximately 1200 to 1500 before Common Era, but which almost certainly encode oral traditions considerably older than their first written form. Agni is simultaneously the fire of the hearth, the fire of the sun, and the fire within the earth. The subterranean fire, the fire beneath the ground, is one of Agni's manifestations in the Vedic cosmological system, and the Agni Purana, one of the 18 major Puranas, treats this subterranean fire with specific attention. The Agni Purana's description of the earth S fire as an expression of the cosmic fire principle, not a geological anomaly, but a manifestation of the same divine principle that governs all fire, provides the cosmological framework within which volcanic activity was understood by the Hindu-influenced cultures of maritime Southeast Asia, including the precursor cultures that influenced pre-colonial Philippine civilization. The Rig Veda's first hymn, the very first text in one of the oldest surviving bodies of religious literature in the world, is addressed to Agni. But the Rig Veda's understanding of Agni extends far beyond the sacrificial fire. In the Vedic cosmological framework, Agni has three births: one from the friction of the fire sticks, one from lightning and storm clouds, and one from the earth itself, from beneath the ground. This third birth of Agni, the fire that emerges from within the earth, is the fire of volcanoes and hot springs. The geothermal fire that the Bicolano communities living above Bulusan's hydrothermal system have been aware of through their thermal springs and fumaroles for 3,000 years. The Vedic tradition explicitly named this subterranean birth of fire as one of Agni's three primary manifestations. The monitoring network at Bulusan is tracking the parameters of exactly that manifestation: hydrothermal fluid heated by the volcanic system, generating seismicity as it moves through the rock, building toward a surface expression. The Rig Veda named it. The seismometer confirms it. The framework differs. The observation is the same. The fourth tradition provides a different kind of connection, not geographic or cultural, but intellectual and documentary. It is the tradition of Gaius Plinius Secundus, known to history as Pliny the Elder, and it matters for tonight to us report because Pliny the Elder represents the point at which the human attempt to observe and systematically record volcanic behavior became explicitly scientific in its ambitions, if not yet in its methods. And because Pliny died doing it, Pliny the Elder documented volcanic islands, the islands produced by submarine volcanic eruptions that appeared and disappeared in the Mediterranean Sea during his lifetime. He documented hot springs and their geological context. He documented the fire that burned continuously in certain locations, eternal flames that we would today recognize as natural gas seeps or geothermal venting. And he documented the relationship between seismic activity and volcanic events, the ground shaking that preceded the surface expression of volcanic energy. This last observation is the one most directly relevant to tonight's report. Pliny the Elder, observing and documenting the volcanic landscape of the ancient Mediterranean world, noted that the trembling of the earth and the eruption of volcanic fire were connected. The ground shaking was a precursor. The eruption followed. He did not understand the mechanism, but he observed the correlation. He recorded it. And then, in 79 of the Common Era, he went to watch the most dramatic volcanic eruption in the recorded history of the ancient Mediterranean world. On the morning of August 24th, 79 of the Common Era, Vesuvius erupted. Pliny the Elder was, at that time, the commander of the Roman naval fleet at Misenum on the Bay of Naples. When he saw the eruption column rising from the mountain, the distinctive umbrella-shaped cloud that his nephew, Pliny the Younger, later described in two famous letters to the historian Tacitus, Pliny the Elder did not flee. He sailed toward the eruption, first to attempt rescue operations, and then to observe from as close as the wind would allow. He was found dead on the beach at Stabiae the following morning, likely killed by the volcanic gases carried across the bay by the wind. Pliny the Elder died conducting a volcanic observation. He is, in that specific sense, the patron of a scientific tradition that PHIVOLCS continues. The tradition of watching the volcano, recording what it does, and getting as close to the event as safety allows in order to gather the most complete possible observational record. His nephew s two letters to Tacitus, the oldest surviving eyewitness accounts of a major volcanic eruption in the Western literary tradition, describe with remarkable precision the observable stages of the Vesuvius eruption, the precursory tremors, the eruption column, the darkening sky, the fall of pumice, the rapidly deteriorating conditions on the ground. Those letters have been studied by volcanologists as primary source material because they contain observational detail that can be validated against the physical evidence preserved in the Pompeii and Herculaneum deposits. What Pliny the Elder's Naturalis Historia contains about the relationship between seismic activity and volcanic eruptions is the oldest systematic Western treatment of the precursor phenomenon that PHIVOLCS is currently observing at Bulusan. He documented the connection. He recorded the correlation between ground shaking and volcanic fire. He understood it as a relationship in the natural world that deserved systematic observation. That intellectual commitment: watch the mountain, understand the relationship between its shaking and its eruptions, record what you find, is the direct intellectual ancestor of the PHIVOLCS monitoring network. Pliny the Elder built the framework from observation. PHIVOLCS uses it with instruments he could not have imagined to document a relationship he first described in systematic terms nearly 2,000 years ago. 4 traditions. The Bicolano Diwata tradition, 3,000 years of community-embedded volcanic hazard monitoring, encoded in the cosmological and ritual practices documented by Spanish missionaries and 20th century ethnographers. The Japanese Shinto tradition of Kagutsuchi and the Kojiki, compiled in 712 of the Common Era from oral traditions considerably older, encoding a cosmological understanding of volcanic fire as simultaneously destructive, creative, cyclical, and taxonomically diverse in its surface expressions. The Vedic Agni tradition, as it reached maritime Southeast Asia through the Majapahit cultural sphere, treating volcanic fire as the subterranean birth of the universal fire principle, named in the oldest hymns in the world, arriving in pre-colonial Philippine culture through the long arc of Indic cultural influence, and the classical Greco-Roman natural philosophical tradition of Pliny the Elder, the first systematic Western documentation of the relationship between ground shaking and volcanic eruption, written by a man who died watching a volcano, leaving behind the oldest written eyewitness account of a major volcanic eruption in the Western record. 4 traditions, each real, each traceable, each examining the same phenomenon, volcanic fire and its precursory signs, from a different cultural and epistemological direction, each arriving at a structural understanding of the relationship between the shaking of the earth and the eruption of fire from below that is consistent with what the PHIVOLCS seismic network is documenting in real time at Bulusan. The data is in the record on both sides of the table. The pattern was observed before our instruments existed to confirm it. That is what the file shows. The interpretation belongs to you. As this report is filed on the evening of May 22nd, 2026, the complete picture of the Bulusan situation requires holding several distinct layers simultaneously: the instrumental, the historical, and the ancient, and understanding what each contributes to the total account. The instrumental layer is the most current: 442 volcano-tectonic earthquakes in 48 hours, 55 events at depths of less than 5 kilometers, GPS inflation of the northern flank for 11 months and the upper western flank for 4 months, so 2 at 121 tons per day. Alert: Level 1, with explicit PHIVOLCS language about possible phreatic eruptions. A phreatic eruption on May 17th that received no international coverage. The historical layer provides the context. The June 2022 sequence: smaller event, continued unrest, larger event, 7 days later. The April 2025 eruption: 53 earthquakes in 24 hours, preceded an event that sent ash 4.5 kilometers high. The current seismic count of 442 in 48 hours is substantially higher than the 53 that preceded the 2025 eruption. That comparison does not constitute a prediction. It constitutes a data point that belongs on the table. The ancient layer provides the depth. 3,000 years of Bicolano observation of this specific volcanic system, encoding in the Diwata tradition a functional understanding of the relationship between observable precursory signs and surface eruption events. 2,000 years of Japanese cosmological encoding of the same relationship in the Kagutsuchi narrative of the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki. The Vedic tradition, naming of the subterranean fire as one of Agni's three births, arriving in pre-colonial Philippine culture through the Majapahit cultural sphere, and Pliny the Elder's systematic documentation of the seismicity eruption relationship in his Naturalis Historia, completed 2 years before he died, watching Vesuvius erupt in 79 of the Common Era. There are specific things to watch in the hours and days ahead. The seismic rate at the Bulusan volcano network, specifically whether the proportion of shallow depth events in the total count is increasing, holding, or decreasing. The GPS deformation data for any acceleration in the inflation rate of the northern and western flanks, the SO2 output for any move above the current background range of 121 tons per day. Any phreatic eruption event at the summit vents, which PHIVOLCS will report immediately through its official channels. And the communities of the Irosin Valley, Irosin, Juban, Casiguran, Bulusan, and Magallanes, whose local government units are in direct communication with PHIVOLCS' monitoring team, and whose residents have lived alongside this mountain as activity for as long as anyone has kept records of it. One final note before this report closes. The name Bulusan itself, the name of the mountain, the name of the municipality at its base, the name that PHIVOLCS uses in every advisory that the Smithsonian Global Volcanism Program logs in its weekly reports, is derived from the pre-colonial Bicolano language. Its precise etymology is debated among Philippine linguists, but its Bicolano origin is not. The mountain was named by the people who lived alongside it before any monitoring network existed, before any formal volcanic hazard assessment was conducted, before any seismometer was installed on its flanks. The name they gave it persists in every document, every advisory, every scientific report filed about this volcano. The people who watched this mountain for 3,000 years before our instruments arrived are still here, in the name of the mountain itself. That is also part of the record. If tonight's report gave you something, the standard coverage of the Bulusan PHIVOLCS advisory did not the complete monitoring picture, the documented eruption history, the ancient traditions that watched this same volcanic system before any instrument existed to measure it, then subscribe. This is what we file every night. The next PHIVOLCS bulletin on Bulusan will contain updated seismic counts. When it does, we will read it, cross-reference it against tonight's baseline, place it in the context of everything we have established, and report what it shows. Subscribe, and you will receive that report with the same depth that tonight/delivered. Every event we cover receives this treatment. Every night we file. The monitoring does not stop when the report ends. We continue to monitor. We will report again at last light.